everyone, and welcome to the 14th episode of the $1 Million Ideas Podcast. During the next couple of weeks, Ken and I are going to be exploring multiple versions and formats for this podcast. And today we have something special from Ken's own experience and a more specific business model breakdown. Hi, Ken. How's it going? How's life?
Good. Have my dad in town, so he's enjoying Bangkok.
Bangkok and Singapore, one of those places where the weather is always like pretty decent. It's not too bad. It's not too hot, not too cold. It must be a nice switch for people coming from the West.
Yeah. He liked it, and then a few days later, he concluded it was just too hot for him. He wants to go back.
Yeah, I guess your body temperature, your tolerance to that temperature sort of like rises and falls it's natural, but it's good to have parents around. All right, cool. So today we're doing something different. The topic today is really going to be Amazon aggregators. And this is a space that you have worked in quite a bit. So we're going to really talk about the business model, which I think really flourished during the COVID and venture capital boom era. Since 2022, when the tides have changed, things are a bit different now. So why don't you take us back? Like, I've started hearing about Amazon aggregators in the US itself before they ever came to Asia, right? Like, I think this was a deal. So maybe we can start with, what is an Amazon aggregator?
Yeah, let me describe it as, I think an aggregator is anytime someone has the intention of consolidating numerous brands, Amazon brands, right? And it used to be Amazon aggregator. Now they've kind of moved away, and they're also focusing a lot on Shopify and TikTok e-commerce. And so I think most of the players have gotten around, like they've all wanted to escape the name Amazon, aggregator, because they're D2C group holding companies essentially. And the other thing I want to say is, like, you cannot really talk about the Amazon aggregator model, which more or less started getting popular in 2022, without talking about what was happening in the Amazon space for about 10 years before that, which is that Amazon drop shipping blasted off, especially in the US, right? And that whole model took off because you had all these like guys who were gurus that were like on YouTube talking about how they made, they were driving Lambos because they were selling private label products that they sourced in China on Amazon. And then all of a sudden, this formula was created that all these people were doing. And then they realized, all right, like I can replicate this model in numerous niches and create this holding company. So people were already creating kind of brand holding companies of these brands that they created themselves, very quickly.
So let's get this right. Let's take a product which was popular, and I don't know, we can stick to beauty products or something else that you think, like, I don't know, kitchen utensils or something to go in the kitchen, like pots and pans or something that was small that everyone started to use. So how would it actually work? Because I know there are several steps in this, because there were tools that you have to use to explore what was selling. Then you have to go and try to find the supplier. And then once you find the supplier, drop shipping made it a lot easier. But how did discovery actually happen if we wanted to start a business like this?
So a lot of people use tools like Jungle Scout and Helium 10 for the discovery part. And that the discovery part is the most important part. Like, that is the one that makes or breaks you. Did you choose the right Amazon niche to launch a product in, right? And choosing the right niche is a function of a number of things. Like, is it too competitive? Are you going up against really entrenched brands? Are there keywords that you can win on? Could you create a better product page, with better images, better video, better text? So you would have to look at and got to understand these different niches, understand how much traffic. So Helium 10, Jungle Scout, like they can tell you, all right, how many people, like what is the approximate sales of this niche? Who are your competitors, right? And then you try to figure out, all right, can I compete?
Okay, so I go to one of these tools, which basically, like Jungle Scout, it sort of like scans all of Amazon. It figures out what is selling. It ranks them. It gives me difficulty of what this is. It gives me potentially what this costs, what it's selling for. So the margin was displayed over there. So when you know a product has high margin. There's not too much traffic over there and people haven't discovered it just yet. So I pick one of these and then I set up the whole Amazon store where I put them. I create some branding, but most of my distribution happens through Amazon. And the fulfillment of these products also happens via Amazon. So I basically tell my Chinese supplier that please send this much product to the Amazon warehouse. And then every day I talk about how much money I'm making and how I've become this e-commerce wizard now.
Yeah. I would say some of those steps are a little bit more intricate. Like at the beginning, you'll source often through Alibaba.com, which is a B2B sourcing site, and you'll talk with various factories. You'll just get quotes. You'll get a sample. You'll choose one. You'll have to make a purchase order of a certain MOQ. Usually it's at least a few hundred. Like you're talking a few $1,000 investment. And then back in the day, and even now to some extent, like you're only really competitive on Amazon if you're using Amazon Prime, which is 2-day shipping in the US, which requires you being in a domestic Amazon warehouse, which means that you need to import everything into the US and stick it in a warehouse and start paying storage fees and shipping fees and all this. So that's the classic model. This model is changing a little bit these days because drop shipping has gotten so cheap and fast from China because of Temu and Shein and these guys. So like you can get from China to the US in about a week for only like $6 or $7. So it's changing a little now.
So we have this model. Let's say that I had started this in 2016. I thought like this was great. I started to replicate this. But before we start about replicating, how profitable were these things? Because our net margins after advertising, delivery, cost of warehousing, all of these things, are these like 20% net margin businesses?
I think there's no golden rule. Like if you watch the YouTube videos of that time, you were always told to choose this very cheap product and put a really big margin on it. You were usually at least 100% margin, sometimes even like more than that. So advertising in the Amazon game was very much a way of boosting your product early on so that you would start getting organic traffic on certain keywords. And then once you were in organic, then that was very profitable traffic. But if you needed to continue advertising it, maybe like whenever you're advertising and you make a sale, like that is probably break even or maybe even at a loss. But you're trying to get more organic.
So you had these 100% gross margins and then you were doing all of these shenanigans. And I guess a lot of these people hadn't run proper businesses before or P&L. So maybe there was not as much financial sort of like diligence going on over here. So they did this for a while. And the person thought that, okay, now I can do this multiple times if they got good at it. And I guess that they built a couple of streams of income. And this started to happen and became a lot like during the cheap money era, I guess consumerism was also peaking. COVID was a massive peak because everyone was at home and was doing all of the shopping. Where was the opportunity that an aggregator saw when they saw all of this happening? Because D2C, as far as I know, is a very, very competitive game once you get a decent amount of scale, because then you face competition, margins get compressed, and you have to run a very, very lean operation to really make this work.
Yeah, I think this whole aggregator thing I think it was heavily influenced by some finance people. I don't know the exact history with Thrasio and some of the early guys, but I bet you're going to find some iBankers involved early days who looked at this thing and said, I can buy these smaller, unprofessional companies that are quite profitable at multiple of, say, 3x profit or whatever. And then if I hit the kind of P&G level of, okay, I create a group holding and I'm this professional company and I can go IPO, then I can get a multiple of, say, 6x, right? So it was like a finance play of buy low, sell high, and you don't even need to add that much value. So that's how I think this whole idea really started to scale.
I can see that happening. I mean, Cody Sanchez is doing this on the other side, which is like, hey, buy all these cheap, boring businesses, and then they either provide you cash flow or you roll them up and then you sell them back out. So I can see how that started, because I think Cody really blew up during the COVID era as well with doing this on the side. But I think with these aggregators, so The opportunity they probably saw was that there's a bunch of cost, which is through warehousing, advertising, and at some degree of scale, you'll be able to lower those costs and therefore improve margins as well. And you would just get economies of scale when were aggregators going into specific niches only? Like, there's Constellation Group, which basically buys SaaS software in the US, and it's this massive company that not too many people know about, but, they pick Texas and then they figure out like who are the big dental clinic appointment software companies, and they just go and they buy all of them, consolidate them, and it just becomes this massive cash machine for them if it works. So I wonder whether in your experience, were they doing consolidation in certain niches specifically, or were they going broad?
I think that relatively quickly, everyone started picking one or a couple of niches. So I was helping a company branded in early 21. They were already saying, hey, we're going to focus on home and living and beauty. And most of the aggregators had a little bit of a focus. I think Thrasio and maybe the really early ones had started quite wide and realized that that's a harder way to go. The other thing that I think changed is they were buying these kind of crappy brands at the early on, which had no real brand loyalty. And it was just really this cheap private label stuff that people were using, Alibaba to source. And they were just really good at gaming the whole Amazon system because you can game the keywords and whatnot. There's a lot of people who are very good at that. And then I think the early aggregators bought some of those companies and got burned and then realized, no, like we want something that has a unique brand, a bit of loyalty. There's not like 1,000 other products that look just like it. So they started learning very quickly.
So let's get in. So you get into one of these firms, branded or something. And what was it like when you joined the company? Had they already raised a whole bunch of money? Like what was happening?
Yeah, they had raised, I think, around 150 million, which was a mix of debt and equity. And I think quite a bit of debt. And this was part of the problem. We will talk about this later, but venture debt was very kind of accessible to these companies early on. And the belief was that they would pay it back easily because they'd get these higher multiples, which ended up not really panning out. But I would say the other thing that really kind of early 21, a lot of these companies thought they were almost like software companies. So they had these valuations in mind that were typically applied to software and not e-commerce, because e-commerce, like you're dealing with just the profit is the margin. You don't have software that you can just keep selling. And so they thought of themselves a bit as software companies and started building really big software teams. And they thought that they were going to build these moats based on the software they built that would give them advantages. And I think that proved mostly to be not true. So for example, the company I was helping, which is now called Esser, which was branded, they built a few things that they ended up using, but the rest, they just kind of concluded that, all right, the Amazon space is full of SaaS software that is pretty good. And it doesn't really make sense to rebuild this because we're not going to build it that much better.
And so what's it a software? So tell me, like they're trying to figure out, so for the average user who's listening to this, we have these e-commerce companies which have revenue lines which are coming in. They have decent gross profit. So basically the landed cost of the product is there. So gross profit is pretty healthy. But then there are these big line items which probably will be like advertising, ops, and other sort of like things. Like what are the big chunky items for expenses on the aggregators that really reduce that net margin? Is it primarily advertising solely, or is there something else?
No, I would say the biggest thing that drives most of these e-commerce, like the ones that are better than the ones that aren't, is their management of inventory. Because if you're in this game, on Amazon, you really get penalized pretty hard for selling out, stocking out. So you end up not sticking to kind of conventional inventory management wisdom. And you'll just buy like 6 months of inventory, right? And you'll keep it somewhere. And sometimes you're not even like some of the fulfillment providers, they're losing stuff and you're not really tracking it well. So I would say inventory is one of the biggest cost items and like the thing that really makes or breaks the most. Advertising is a function of what category you're in and how well you're positioned with your product. But I think the other big problem that the aggregators made is that they bought these profitable brands, because generally the aggregators, when they went shopping, they would look for these brands that were making, from $1 million in revenue and up and were profitable already. So the idea was we'll buy a bunch of profitable brands We'll make them slightly more profitable because we're going to consolidate the process and have more economies of scale and all this. But the part that they messed up is that they bought all these profitable brands and then they stuck like a big overhead, which was their central expensive team, which had like, ex-Goldman people and McKinsey people and people that were expensive and attracted to this segment, but didn't really have much experience.
All right. So we find the culprit really, which is also this heavy team cost. This $1 million brand, this owner was probably paying himself out of net profit and things that he was getting. Over here, these people load up the cost over here on the books as expenses because these people are supposed to not only run this, like making 200,000 or 300,000 a year is not very interesting for them. They need to figure out how to, like you said, raise a whole bunch of debt and get this going. So I guess when you raise debt, there's interest as well on that debt that you're raising. And you have this expensive team. And suddenly those net margins, which may have looked very attractive at 1 million when you're scaling to 10 million plus, start to become compressed and the model started to break. They obviously, what you said was they were trying to build software to make them more efficient. Like, was that the case? Like, efficiency was the case, or was it to help them scout or basically everything full stack in the business?
I think nobody that I know of wanted to build everything full stack because there's a lot of software involved in this business and there's a lot of SaaS tools. So you'd never want to rebuild your own Jungle's Cat Helium 10. Like, they're good enough. You might build some other tools that help you like find trends that nobody else has. Like you have these little pocket things you see as kind of your competitive advantage. And I think in supply chain was where there wasn't good supply chain software specifically for Amazon and e-commerce that was built for companies of this scale. So I was one of the ones that for Branded in 21 looked at this space. I was like, all right, like what supply chain software should we use? Because the inventory management is very complex. You're ordering POs months in advance from China, coming over ship, getting spread out among various fulfillment centers. Some of it sent to Amazon. So like, this is something that I think a lot of people invested in supply chain because the stuff off the shelf wasn't that good.
So this happened. These people were betting on the fact that we're going to hit this economies of scale. Once we have a certain amount of demand and we figured out the model where we can eke out this net profit, which is significant, but not like massive. I think like when I look at like PNG type P&Ls, and if we even pull them up over here on the screen, I think like they're not going to be like naturally software companies, but if you can reliably generate that demand and grow month over month. So let's talk about growth. Like, how was an aggregator supposed to grow? Let's say that I bought like $5 million worth of revenue right now, and the market, especially if I raise this funding, is expecting me to grow at a healthy clip. So was growth primarily a function of just growing the brands that I bought, or was it buying new brands? Like, were you guys buying new brands every month? Like, what was happening? How is growth happening?
This is where I think some evolution happened as well. I think aggregators, when they first started, they thought they were going to buy all these companies and that this thing was just going to continue to scale well. And then when they bought a bunch, they realized how much of a pain in the ass it was because every company has... Like, you're typically buying the founder and keeping him on board with some kind of earnout over a couple of years. And so you have this guy who has his own culture, his own style. He's going to have his own opinion about whether you as the aggregator are doing things right. So when you have a bunch of the people like that, like you're trying to manage them, that is like a whole management task that becomes challenging. And then each of those companies have their own culture, their own processes. So this is one of the largest like integration M&A efforts I've ever seen. And they're trying to do it really fast. And then that ends up breaking down. So what I think most of the aggregators have ended up concluding is don't buy too many companies. The only way you really create value in this game anyway is by launching new products on brands that exist, not really launching new brands. Like, you don't want like 100 brands, especially in the same category, because it's just like unwieldy. You want one or a couple, and you just want to like launch more and more products. And that's kind of what P&G and all these guys do. So that is where I think they all evolve to, is like, we don't need a lot of brands, but what we need to be able to do, which we didn't know how to do, is launch new products successfully on these brands that we own. And that requires you to think like an Amazon entrepreneur, which a lot of these aggregators didn't have in their DNA.
when you started to talk about the strategy shift, I was like, these were finance people that looked at P&Ls and balance sheets and figured out like, okay, I'm buying, like you said, I'm buying profit for 3 times, then I'm going to do this. And, if this continues to scale. And guess what? When a business is sub 1 million, it's like easier for month-to-month growth to look pretty decent and things like this. But eventually it hits this plateau because it's like swim lanes. It's like, okay, you find this little niche, but it's a small niche. And then when you start to grow it a bit, you sort of like merge into this bigger sort of like river that's flowing, right? And now you're one of many when you get up there. And that's where competence, like you said, comes in. Like, let's say that we started for example, I bought a home living, like I'm just giving an example, a home living sort of like thing. Like, I don't know, I know from Pakistan what was going out quite a bit was these Himalayan salt lamps or something like that, right? This is a big property. Like, I have a lot of friends who made a lot of money on this. So anyways, indigenous to Pakistan going out, the person in Pakistan who is making $200,000 a year is super happy with this. But let's say that we start aggregating and you want to get into the more healthy home living space. But once you start to expand the brand, you face competition. And then I don't know whether like these people, it's just competing in the wrong thing. It's like, would you put like an iBanker in charge of new product launches at the home living division at Crate and Barrel or something? Like, I don't think like he would know because the distance from the customer is so large. Like, they're too separated from the customer. Anyway, so this happened and then they got the 1-2 punch. They felt the scaling challenges and then the venture capital market gave way in 22 as well, which meant they couldn't start raising more money as well to get themselves out of this problem. So then what happened past 22? Like, how did they evolve? Because I know some of them have merged and still alive, but is this model still something viable, or is this experiment with all this money proven that, like you said, leave this to someone who understands the space in the space and then scale this versus making this M&A play?
I think they needed to learn the streets. Like, I view it as like you had these like nice ex-McKinsey Goldman people that kind of like entered this space, that most of the entrepreneurs in this space were like these hustler Amazon type guys, right? Who took small salaries and they really felt the product, the customer problem and all that. So these fancier guys needed to be able to think like those. And so the first thing they needed to do, because they had such high overheads, is that they needed to wipe out like 80% of their overhead teams. And so that's what happened. It's like they got rid of all these finance people because they realized we don't really need to buy any more companies. They got rid of like a lot of the like McKinsey people because they realized, all right, like we don't really need that shit. And and then like they pared their teams down and they started to really listen to some of these entrepreneurs that they had bought who were now part of their teams. And they started to run, much leaner operations, and they probably like integrated a bit less. Like they let the brands kind of continue to operate as they were because they were successful. And sometimes when they tinkered, like they tinkered in the wrong way. So yeah, like a lot of them have survived and are profitable now. And I think a lot of them have had difficulty paying down their venture debt, but, restructured that. And the ones that made it. Thrasio, some big guys like did make it, but I think a lot did.
All right, that's cool. I think like the evolution, sort of like when we think about products, ideas, businesses, I think like I have this thing that I talk a lot about in HRV, which is distance to the customer. And whenever that distance increases from the core teams that are either building something for the customer or not interacting with the customer, or have these weird assumptions about who the customer is, I feel like that's the core of the problem that sort of like becomes huge. You talked about this, like, teams that bought businesses where they thought the customer was the entrepreneur that they were buying and the business that they were buying, that they understood because they were all numbers, but it was a hop away from the actual customers. And like you said, build a brand and then go deep and widen a specific space. That means you're selling to one customer who you deeply understand their problems about, and now you're selling multiple products to them. And then they trust you because, you've got that whole loyalty going.
Yeah, now I would say that the game has evolved with TikTok. So now I don't think you see any of these aggregators focusing just on Amazon. Like Amazon is generally seen as the low margin, kind of like it's a price war all the time. The Chinese are up against you. So what you're trying to do is create differentiated brands that you sell on your own, Shopify, TikTok store. And therefore, to sell successfully on those channels, like you need to create good content. The only way you're going to create good content is by actually like being a customer of that niche and understanding, the customer and what kind of content they want. So I think that is where you're at now. I think a lot of these guys, like they're making a lot of money off TikTok and they've really gone down deep on how to create good content. And they've realized that the only way you're going to create these communities of people with good content is by really understanding the product and the customer really well.
Yeah. And the deal is the best content is not that expensive to make when you think about it. It's basically understanding the problems, delivering it. Because I think the overdone, over sort of like produced content on TikTok also doesn't do so well. I think it's a very natural sort of UGC material, which is doing well. And that content is inexpensive to create, but it takes a lot of creativity to do it. And I do think it's more of a young person's game as well, because there's just spending so much time on it. I wonder whether they've sort of like learned their lesson again, because that's another skill that you can't directly sort of like hire completely for unless the person just comes in and starts working for you. Like there must be shops or agencies in the world which sort of like offer to do UGC videos and all the stuff for your product for. My gut tells me that, they could probably do a decent job, but I don't think that they'll knock it out of the park with a founder level sort of like affinity to the space and customer.
Yeah. I think what I've seen is that the bigger aggregators take this content thing in-house and they hire for it. But they hire people that have a proven track record for doing it well. So like Branded hired like a TikTok woman who was pretty good at it, and had done it for years, either in an agency or something.
Well, it's interesting how the model sort of like evolved and where it is right now. I think the lesson is that usually like things that look pretty straightforward, I'll buy a business for 3x, consolidate a bunch, and then sell it for 6x. It usually doesn't work so easily for that. So if anyone is selling you a course, a book, or something like that to get this done and make your millions, be wary is the thing. And I think like the last thing is like, wherever you get too abstracted away from who the customer is, you just generally run into all of these problems because you create imaginary problems that we saw, like, all right, let's create the software stack, or let's hire these people, or let's take on this debt and grow much faster. I think intellectually, it makes a lot of sense when you were to put it into an exercise. But I felt like when, like you said, like they brought it down the streets, it meant like, no, you worked backwards from actually how you were supposed to do this. Well, that's what venture is there for, right? Like to provide money for all of these experiments. And hopefully one of these companies will then make it out and then repay everyone back in their funds.
Yeah, I think they've come through this big journey, but they're still sitting on something that is interesting in that there were not many big D2C brands that were born from e-commerce. Now the brands that they have that are doing well are doing pretty well, and now they're starting to go offline, and like all the offline channels like Walmart and all these guys, like they're getting more and more adept at working with these e-commerce brands and changing what's on their shelves to be these D2C e-com brands. So I think they're now really starting to benefit from TikTok, what's happened, and the multiples if you're successful in creating a D2C brand these days is still pretty good. So I think some of them will have some nice exits, I believe. And like here in Southeast Asia, you got Una Brands and you got Rainforest Life, a couple others.
And I think Rainforest started the other way, right? Rainforest started as a way to provide like funds to buy these. I remember when they launched, it was like plug in your Stripe sort of like system into us and then we'll evaluate and then we'll figure out how to make an offer. It was basically like the Keats Boys sort of like I'll buy your home sort of like business as well. You just tell me where you are. My algos will figure out what it's worth and I'll make you an offer sort of like thing.
Yeah, this was, the 21, 22 golden days when everybody was competing on how quickly they could make you an offer. And then they realized, all right, that's like a race to the bottom. Like there's no need to do that. And we don't need to buy that many brands. And then they kind of repositioned.
Cool. Well, this was interesting. I think like my thoughts on this episode now as we conclude this episode is that we went through a business model and we went through the challenges, and Ken had some direct experience, and I was learning along the way. I would love to get some feedback from everyone who watched this, and if you could leave a comment. Was this helpful? Like, did you learn a bunch from there, or would you like us to go even deeper on the businesses and open up like financials and things like that, or specific strategies that they used and give more examples? It'd be great to get some feedback as to how we're doing. We're testing out a whole bunch of stuff. So that was my thought. Ken, how did you think about the episode? Like, what did you think?
I like this style, like going deeper on a segment and what's the journey it went through, where is it today? So I like that a lot. And I think, like as long as it's topics that we really understand well, we can bring a lot. That's the only, like, whether that can be done consistently across lots of other niches is the concern I'd have.
Well, as we're in this exploratory journey, we're going to be testing out a whole bunch of these ideas, and we would really appreciate it if you would leave a comment, DM us, or any feedback would be great so that we can actually figure out what's working and what's not. But till next week then, all the very best. Thanks, Ken, and I will speak to you next week.